Some insults don't echo, they burn in silence. Arnold Schwarzenegger had faced critics all his life about his body, his accent, even his past. But that night on live television, when Karoline Leavitt told him to go back to Austria, he didn't raise his voice. He reached for something deeper, a memory, a name, and a truth that would silence the entire nation. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances, don't forget to subscribe. The CNN studio lights burned bright over a stage set for confrontation. You could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that makes producers sweat and viewers sit a little straighter in their chairs. Two figures took their places beneath the glow, one young, sharp, and blazing with ambition. The other, older, silent, and carved from something harder than stone. Karoline Leavitt, 27, former White House press secretary, and now a rising star in hardline conservative politics, leaned forward in her chair with the smug confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. Blonde hair styled to perfection, navy blazer crisp, every inch of her presentation designed to project power and provoke. Across from her sat Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yes, that Arnold, former Mr. Olympia, former Terminator, former governor of California, and still, somehow, larger than life. He adjusted his jacket slowly, calmly, as if this were not a live broadcast, but a silent reckoning. No tie, no pretense, just a black shirt and that quiet gaze that had once made action villains flinch and political opponents squirm. The contrast was jarring. She represented fury, fire, and a politics built on division. He represented something slower, older, forged in sweat, silence, and scars. And even before a single word was spoken, America was already choosing sides. Anderson Cooper, the evening's moderator, welcomed viewers and introduced the topic: immigration, national identity, and the future of conservative values. The words sounded neutral enough, but everyone watching knew the real stakes. This wasn't just a debate, it was a duel of worldviews. One side believed America was being stolen from within. The other had lived its dream, one slow and painful step at a time. Karoline smiled with practiced ease, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Arnold didn't smile at all. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Millions watching at home leaned in, not because of what would be said, but because of what might be revealed. This was no ordinary matchup. This was a storm meeting a mountain. To the younger generation, Karoline was the future, unapologetically bold, proudly nationalist, fiercely articulate. To many others, Arnold was something else entirely. Not just a relic of Hollywood or a footnote in California politics, but a symbol of a time when the American dream meant coming with nothing and building everything. The camera cut between the two. Her eyes darted, scanning for openings. His eyes didn't move, he simply listened. That was his first power. He let silence do the talking, but the silence was deceptive. It wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Karoline was first to speak. Her tone was sharp, confident, laced with the kind of edge that grabs headlines. She talked about national pride, about preserving American culture, about closing borders and protecting real American values. And with each word, her voice grew bolder, more forceful, but there was something else beneath the surface, something darker, not quite spoken, but definitely implied. Arnold, still silent, blinked slowly. If the remarks bothered him, he didn't show it. Not yet. He sat as if he had all the time in the world. And maybe he did. After all, he had spent decades proving people wrong. In bodybuilding, in film, in politics, he had endured mockery, rejection, and the kind of disdain that destroys most men. But he didn't rage. He trained. He studied. He returned. Again and again. That too was a kind of patriotism. Karoline didn't see it. Or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. She was on the attack, and her eyes gleamed with the thrill of battle. America, she said, was not built for men like him. The audience stirred. The comment wasn't fully clear, but it didn't have to be. Everyone knew what she meant, and yet Arnold said nothing, still, because sometimes power doesn't come from reacting, it comes from restraint. Cooper shifted in his chair. The viewers could feel it coming, something big, something sharp, but not yet. First, America needed to remember who this man really was, and what he had endured to sit in that chair. Not just muscle, not just movies, not just a name, but a story, a storm that had started decades ago in a cold kitchen in Austria, a story that Karoline was about to mock, and a silence she would soon regret provoking. It started with a smirk. Just a twitch at the corner of her lips, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but Arnold noticed. Karoline Leavitt had been waiting for this moment. She didn't come to discuss policy, she came to provoke. And now that the cameras were rolling and the audience was leaning in, she delivered the line she had practiced in front of a mirror 100 times. "It's easy to act American when the cameras are on," she said, her eyes locked on Arnold. "But some people never really belong, no matter how many movies they star in." There was a flicker in the room, like someone had just turned down the temperature. The audience shifted, some glancing nervously at each other. Cooper blinked, his hand half raised, uncertain if this was the moment he should intervene. Arnold said nothing. Karoline leaned in, sensing opportunity. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued, voice rising, riding the wave she had summoned. "You talk a lot about America, Mr. Schwarzenegger, but your story, it starts in Austria. You weren't born here, you weren't raised here. You came here as a bodybuilder who could barely speak English. You made your fortune in Hollywood, good for you, but that doesn't make you one of us." The gasp wasn't loud, but it was real. Even in an age of constant outrage, something about that line crossed a line. Still, she wasn't finished. "Not even close. You keep reminding us that you were governor of California," she said, her tone sharpening into something colder. "But that was a different time, a time when voters were confused. We don't need imported politicians. We need American leaders who understand American struggles." Arnold sat still, not frozen, anchored, not angry, composed. That unnerved her, so she struck harder. "Maybe it's time," Karoline said, slow and deliberate. "You stopped pretending to be something you're not. And maybe it's time you went back to Austria and left this country to people who actually belong here." The words hit the air like a slap, and this time the silence wasn't subtle, it was brutal. Even Cooper's mouth hung slightly open, stunned not just by the words, but by the intent behind them. Go back to Austria. There it was, the phrase, the dagger wrapped in patriotism, the kind of sentence that echoes long after it's spoken. Somewhere backstage, a CNN producer put his head in his hands. The control room lit up with chatter, but in the center of the storm, Arnold didn't move. His breathing stayed steady, his gaze didn't falter. And that quietness, that absolute refusal to break, was louder than any rebuttal. Karoline folded her arms, pleased with the silence, mistaking it for victory. She didn't see what was coming. She didn't know that silence can be strategy. That sometimes the strongest response is the one that takes its time. Because Arnold had heard worse. In gym locker rooms where no one thought he belonged. In casting rooms where his accent was mocked and his muscles dismissed. In political offices where he was treated like a prop, not a policymaker. He'd been underestimated so many times, it had become familiar, almost funny. But what Karoline had just done wasn't funny, it was revealing. She hadn't attacked his politics, she had attacked his presence, his right to call himself American, his right to sit in that chair, on that stage, under those lights. She had tried to erase his journey with one sentence, and the country felt it. The audience, the crew, the millions watching at home. They didn't all agree with Arnold's policies, some didn't even like him, but they understood, in that moment, that something ugly had been unleashed. Something that didn't belong in America, no matter how loudly it wore the flag. Arnold took a breath, not shallow, not rushed, deep, controlled. Then, for the first time that night, he moved. He leaned forward, not to attack, not to defend, but to begin. And what he was about to say wouldn't just change the tone of the debate. It would change the way people saw what it means to be American. He leaned forward, slowly, deliberately. Not like someone preparing to strike, but like someone lifting something heavy from deep inside his chest. Arnold didn't look at Karoline. He didn't need to. His eyes found a spot on the floor, just in front of him, like the past was sitting there waiting. "Let me tell you a story," he said. His voice was low, not loud, but it carried in the way only a voice sharpened by decades of silence could. I was born in a village most Americans have never heard of, Thal, Austria. A kitchen with no heat, no refrigerator, no running water, just one bed shared with a brother who would later die in a car crash before either of us had the chance to say goodbye. The room stilled, no one moved, no one breathed. My father, Arnold continued, was a local police chief, strict, cold, a man who never understood why his son would rather lift weights than follow orders. And when I say strict, I don't mean discipline, I mean fear. I mean fists on the table, I mean silence after dinner. I dreamed of escape before I even knew where America was. A camera operator near the side wiped his eye, adjusting his focus. Arnold didn't notice. He was somewhere else now. At 15, I found a picture of a man named Reg Park. He had muscles like Greek statues. He had played Hercules in films. I thought, maybe if I look like that, I can leave this place. Maybe my body can be the passport I was never born with. There was no arrogance in his tone, no bragging, just fact laid bare. So I trained. I lifted rusty weights in the backyard while the neighbors laughed. I worked construction during the day and trained at night. And I learned English, one word at a time, with a dictionary in my back pocket while carrying bricks on my shoulder. A flicker of pride rose in his voice, but it was tempered by memory. When I was 21, I came to America with $20 in my wallet and a duffel bag filled with dreams that didn't translate well. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know anyone, but I knew this country had something my village never offered, the chance to become something more than I was. He looked up now, not at Karoline, but at the crowd, at the idea of America itself. I slept on floors, ate cheap tuna from a can. I was told I would never make it in Hollywood because of my name, my accent, my body. They told me I was too much, too foreign, too everything. He paused, the silence thick around him. But I didn't stop. I kept showing up. Audition after audition, rejection after rejection. I didn't ask for favors. I asked for opportunity. Then, quietly, almost with a smile, eventually they stopped laughing and started listening. That line didn't need applause, it just lingered. I became the youngest Mr. Universe, then the most decorated bodybuilder in history, then the first immigrant action hero to dominate global box offices, and later the first foreign-born governor of California since 1862. He looked at Karoline now, not with anger, with clarity. They said I could never do any of it, and yet I did. She shifted, but didn't speak. You talk about American values, he said, his voice still calm. I lived them, I earned them, not through bloodline, not through ancestry, but through effort. He let that sit, no rush, no need to sell it, just truth. You can call me foreign, you can mock my past, you can even tell me to go back to Austria. But this country, this America, welcomed me not because of where I was born, but because of what I chose to become. The room was silent, but no longer cold. It was warm now, heavy with recognition. I didn't pretend to be American, he said. I worked to deserve it. And then one last glance at the audience, one final breath. That's the difference. Anderson Cooper, still holding the moderator's notes in his hand, didn't speak. Neither did Karoline. The studio had turned into something else entirely, not a debate stage, but a quiet room filled with echoes. The kind that don't make noise, but leave something behind. Arnold sat back slightly, his voice softer now. You want to know why I didn't respond to your insult right away? He asked, almost as if to himself. Because I've been told to leave before, in different ways, in different languages. His eyes didn't burn, they didn't flicker, they settled. When I was a boy, I wanted to leave home so badly I used to pretend I didn't hear my father come in. He was a soldier once, a man who never forgave himself for the things he did. But instead of healing, he passed that pain down. I learned early how to survive silence. And I learned even earlier when to hold it. A pause, heavy human. When I was 24, my older brother Maynard died in a car crash. Drunk, angry, we hadn't spoken in months. We were different men. And after the call came, I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding the phone, hearing the word dead over and over again like it was in a loop. That silence, that regret never leaves you. It just moves deeper. The room was frozen. Karoline shifted in her chair, but Arnold didn't look her way. Years later, I built a foundation in his name, paid for his son's education, never told anyone, because some debts aren't loud, they're private. The next words came slower, harder. I made mistakes, public ones, painful ones. I hurt people I loved, and I lost things I can't ever get back. When the world found out I had a son from an affair, the headlines came like fire. They didn't care about context. They shouldn't have. It was my fault. And I didn't ask for sympathy. I didn't go on talk shows. I didn't write a book explaining it all away. I took responsibility. I tried to be present. I tried to be better. His voice didn't waver. You don't get to rewrite pain. You live with it, quietly. A beat. I lost my mother in 1998. She was the one who believed in me when no one else did. She couldn't speak English, but she'd clip articles with my name in it, even if she didn't understand a word. After she passed, I built a memorial in our hometown, not for the cameras, for her, for where I came from. He looks straight ahead now, not at anyone in particular, maybe not even at anyone at all. That's why I don't explode when insulted. That's why I don't yell. I've lived with louder things than your voice. The studio lights felt dimmer somehow. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, full of memory, full of choices made without applause. You said I don't understand America, he continued. But maybe understanding doesn't always come from books or slogans or bloodlines. Maybe it comes from loss, from rebuilding, from falling and deciding to stand back up without asking anyone to catch you. His voice dropped even lower. That's why I stayed quiet, not because I was hurt, but because I've already survived worse. He let those words hang, not to win points, not to make headlines, just to be understood, just for a second. Anderson Cooper looked like he wanted to speak, but didn't. Karoline's lips were pressed tight now, her eyes no longer fiery, but flickering with something else. The cameras rolled on, but in that moment, nothing more needed to be said. The past had finally spoken, and America was listening. Arnold didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his posture. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folder. It wasn't thick, just a few pages. But the weight of what it held would collapse the entire stage. Since we're talking about who belongs in America, he said, let's look at where we all come from. Karoline's smile flickered for the first time. She didn't know what was coming. Not yet. Before I came here tonight, I asked my team to pull public immigration records, Arnold continued. Not yours, Karoline, your family's, just to understand the roots you speak of so often. You call them deep American roots. I wanted to see how deep they really go. The folder opened with a soft flick. The sound landed like thunder. Your great-grandfather, Thomas Leavitt, arrived in the United States in 1892. He was denied entry twice, once in Halifax, once in New York. His application was marked for concern, no occupation, no known relatives, no resources. The audience shifted. Anderson Cooper blinked. Karoline sat still, blinking too fast. But on the third attempt, Arnold said, he was accepted, not because of heritage, not because of lineage, but because a man named Erich Fischer signed as his sponsor. A textile worker from Chicago. Arnold looked up now, an Austrian immigrant. The studio fell into a hush. It wasn't silence, it was the sound of history closing in. That man, Arnold said, came to America from Vienna just 2 years earlier. He had built a small business from nothing, worked long hours, saved every dollar. And when asked why he would sign for a stranger, he said something simple. He's not a stranger, he's a man who needs a start. I was him once. The screen behind them lit up. CNN producers, realizing what was unfolding, brought the documents on screen. Immigration records, census lines, grainy black and white photographs, all real, all verifiable, all devastating. Arnold continued, without that Austrian man, without Erich Fischer, your family never would have stayed in America. You wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be on this stage, you wouldn't be asking others to leave. The twist wasn't just poetic, it was surgical, precise, a full circle drawn with a single sentence. So when you tell me to go back to Austria, Arnold said, you're speaking against the very bloodline that allowed yours to remain. Karoline opened her mouth, but nothing came out. There were no talking points left, no slogans, no easy way to spin it. The irony was too thick to cut. "This isn't a gotcha moment," Arnold added. "It's a mirror, and I want you to look into it." He leaned forward. "You called me an outsider. You tried to shame me for where I came from. But the truth is, America was built by outsiders. Men and women who came here with nothing but a name, a will, and a hope. Just like my father, just like Erich Fischer, just like your great-grandfather." The lights in the studio felt hotter now, not because of the cameras, but because of what had been exposed. This wasn't politics anymore, it was legacy. "I've been called many things in my life," Arnold said. "Foreign, dumb, illegitimate, even dangerous. But never once did I use where someone came from to discredit who they are." His voice held steady. "Because I know how quickly the story changes. I know how easy it is to forget that today's stranger is tomorrow's neighbor, that the man you mock might be the reason you're even allowed to speak." The audience stirred, not with applause but with stillness, respectful, ashamed, moved. "You asked me to go back to Austria," he said one last time. "But maybe it's you who needs to go back, not physically, historically. Go back to your family's origin story. Go back and thank the stranger who gave them a chance. And then ask yourself if you would do the same for anyone else." He closed the folder gently and set it down. The room didn't explode. It didn't need to, it simply stopped. A debate stage turned into a courtroom, and history had just delivered its verdict. He didn't wait for applause, he didn't expect one. After the silence settled, Arnold leaned back slightly in his chair, let the folder rest on the table, and looked straight into the camera. Not to Anderson Cooper, not to Karoline Leavitt, but to the millions watching at home. "I've heard that phrase more times than I can count," he said. "Go back." His voice wasn't bitter, it wasn't even angry, it was steady, anchored. "Go back to where you came from, go back to Austria, go back to the gym, go back to Hollywood." People said it like it was a dismissal, but I always heard it as something else. A challenge. He stood up, slowly, not with defiance but with weight, with history. His hands were calm at his sides, his posture straight, every motion deliberate. "When I first said I'll be back, it was in a movie," he continued. "Just a line, 3 words, but over the years people kept repeating it, not because of the action, not because of the explosions, but because it meant something deeper. A beat. I'll be back means I don't quit. It means I return, I rebuild, I rise. That's what being American is to me, not where you start, but how many times you're willing to come back stronger." His eyes were clear now, sharper. "I didn't stay in this country because I was invited. I stayed because I earned my place. I served as governor. I built jobs. I opened free after-school programs for kids whose names most politicians don't bother to learn. I built sports centers with my own money in neighborhoods where no one else would invest. I didn't do it for power. I did it because I remembered what it was like to be young, broke, and invisible." The audience was frozen, not clapping, not coughing, not breathing, just listening. "You think patriotism is about proving how American you are," he said, glancing toward Karoline. "But real patriotism is about helping others find their place here too." A soft rustle in the back of the room broke the tension. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, sitting in the studio audience, held up a handmade poster. No one told her to do it. It just rose up, quiet and bright. The sign said, "My dad served too." Arnold saw it, nodded, walked toward her. He didn't say a word. Just knelt beside her chair, shook her hand with both of his, and whispered something only she could hear. Cameras caught the moment, the emotion, the weight of legacy passing through a handshake. Then he turned back to the stage, walked up. Faced the audience, the cameras, the country. "You want to talk about who gets to stay in America?" he asked. "I'll tell you, it's the people who show up, the ones who give more than they take. The ones who don't back down, even when they're told they don't belong." A final pause. "I said I'd be back, but the truth is I never left." The screen faded slightly, but the image of him standing there still, unwavering, didn't. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone that Arnold hadn't come to defend himself. He came to defend the idea of belonging, and he had done it without yelling, without insults, just truth, worn quietly, carried with dignity. The debate was technically still going. Anderson Cooper tried to steer things back to policy, to border security, to funding models. But no one was really listening, not the audience, not the crew, not even Karoline. Because everyone knew the real moment had already passed. And it wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning. The clip of Arnold's takedown began circulating before the lights even cooled. The line, "I never left," hit social media like thunder. Within minutes, #Schwarzenegger is American was trending across every platform. Conservatives, liberals, veterans, immigrants, they all weighed in, not on policy, on principle. A veteran from New Jersey posted a photo of his green card and marine dog tags with the caption, "He said what we all feel." A teacher in Texas tweeted, "My parents came here with nothing. Tonight, Arnold made them feel seen." Late-night hosts abandoned their scripts to replay the moment in full. Editorials ran headlines like, "A bodybuilder just gave the most American speech of the year." But perhaps the most telling reaction came from those closest to Karoline. By sunrise the next day, 3 of her major donors had pulled their support. Her communications director resigned. Her press secretary posted a single sentence before logging off, "My mother is an immigrant." News outlets scrambled to get statements. Most were met with silence. Karoline finally addressed the controversy at a hastily arranged press conference outside a brick campaign office in New Hampshire. Her face was pale, her tone rehearsed. "My comments were taken out of context," she said. "I was speaking about cultural values, not identity." But the full video had already aired. America had already heard the context. And more importantly, they had watched her sit silent as the truth was laid bare. The backlash wasn't just political, it was moral. Church leaders, veterans groups, and even conservative think tanks issued statements affirming that American identity isn't inherited, it's earned. A joint op-ed by 2 senators read, "We may disagree with Arnold Schwarzenegger's policies, but no one can deny the values he stood for last night." Meanwhile, Arnold didn't say another word, no victory lap. No social media statement, no cable news appearances. He flew home, quietly, just as he'd always done, but America kept speaking for him. Within 48 hours, a clip of his "I never left" speech was translated into 19 languages. Immigration advocacy groups shared it in classrooms. Military recruiters began using it in training programs. One headline from the Times of India read, "An Austrian immigrant redefines the American dream." But the most unexpected moment came a week later. During a town hall in South Carolina, a boy about 9 years old raised his hand. When the moderator called on him, he didn't ask about taxes or policy. He just said, "Do you think I could be governor someday, like Arnold?" The crowd laughed gently, but the moderator paused, and then answered, "After last week, I don't think anyone is going to tell you no." Karoline's campaign never recovered. Within a month, she suspended her run, citing a desire to refocus on community outreach. But everyone knew what that meant. Her name would remain on Google, and so would the clip. But not for the reasons she once hoped. As for Arnold, he returned to what he had always done, building, mentoring, showing up where no cameras waited. He opened another youth sports center in East LA. Far from the studios and the spotlight, when asked about the debate in a rare interview, he simply said, "I didn't win anything, I just said what needed to be said." And that, perhaps, was the point. It wasn't a performance. It was a reminder that being American isn't about where you're born, or what language you speak, or how many flags you wave. It's about how much you give, how deeply you serve, and how firmly you stand when someone tries to push you out of the place you've spent your whole life building. In the final shot of the night, long after the audience had left and the lights had dimmed, the cameras caught Arnold walking alone through the CNN hallway. His coat over his arm, his head high, no words, just a man who came to a foreign country, gave it everything, and refused to be told he didn't belong, because he never left. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.